My presentation today is entitled Consciousness and the Machine, and it takes us on a tour of the research that I have been very fortunate to be involved in over the last 25 or 30 years, exploring the brain and how our brain function interacts with our various spiritual and religious experiences, which ultimately have an influence on how we think about consciousness and altered states of consciousness that seem to be part of these types of experiences. But I think that all of this research brings us to some very interesting topics when we talk about what consciousness actually is, how it is related to the brain, and if the brain truly is a remarkable machine, what are the implications for all of that in terms of how we understand consciousness itself and what that means for us as human beings. Now, on one hand, consciousness is something that we all take for granted. We go through our lives as if we have our consciousness, and we certainly feel that we do. But when we start to try to explore consciousness and what it is, and especially when we try to think about whether someone else or something else has consciousness, it gets a lot more challenging. For example, John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, published back in about 1690, defined consciousness as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. So here we're talking about what goes on in our mind that we perceive, and that is ultimately what is defined as consciousness here. In the English word conscious originally derives from the Latin word conscius, which means con, together, and derives from sire, to know. So in some sense, we're talking about how we come together to know something about ourselves and how we are thinking and experiencing the world itself. And a related word is conscientia, which means a shared knowledge and primarily refers to the sense of moral conscience. So there are a lot of different aspects about how we even start to think about consciousness. In fact, I'd kind of challenge each one of you to sit down, write down what you think your own definition of consciousness might be, because it's very important to even think about how we are starting the entire discussion, so that as we start to talk about consciousness and how it relates to the brain, we have some reference point to know what we're talking about. And that in and of itself is very important. Other aspects to try to more definitively define consciousness in the medical world, where I often swim, consciousness usually just means that you're awake. We say that the patient is conscious. That means that they are awake and responding to us. And if they are not responding, then they are unconscious. But consciousness generally means a little bit more than just simply being awake. It has to do with a sense of awareness and ultimately a sense of self-awareness. So awareness refers to our ability to be aware of what's going on around us, if something's hot, cold, what the day looks like out there. But then there is a sense of self-awareness, which is that we are aware of ourselves, being aware of what's going on in the external world. When we talk about definitions of consciousness, we also have to include what we think consciousness is ultimately made of. And what I mean by that is that we need to think about whether consciousness is derivative of material reality. Is it the brain that produces consciousness through all of the different neural connections and so forth? And these are some things we're going to be talking about shortly. Through all those neural connections, does consciousness kind of emerge out of the brain, but basically processed by the brain? So the causal arrow is from the brain to consciousness. Or is consciousness something beyond the physical and the material world? Certainly in various Buddhist and Hindu perspectives, traditions, consciousness kind of pervades the universe, and the physical world really derives from that. So the brain is more of a receiver, if you will, or it kind of interacts with this universal consciousness, but it's not creating the consciousness itself. The consciousness is already out there in the world. So there are different ways of even thinking about, is consciousness something that is really attached to the material and derives from the material, or is it something that somehow goes beyond that? Ultimately, how we study and explore consciousness will probably have an impact on the definitions that we have. So whatever we start with today, saying this is what we think consciousness is, it may change and be modified depending on the studies that we do, how we try to explore what consciousness is, and what those results of those studies ultimately tell us about the nature of consciousness. In terms of those studies, though, of course, we have to think about what states of consciousness could ultimately be studied. As I mentioned in my introduction, I've spent a lot of time studying religious and spiritual experiences, particularly very intense ones like mystical experiences that are associated with an altered state of consciousness. But there are many different states of consciousness that people have experienced, and many of you listening have experienced multiple states of consciousness, dream states, the everyday reality state that we have, perhaps some unusual spiritual experience of some type. But there are there's a whole continuum of these experiences, and that also plays into what should we be studying in terms of trying to understand what consciousness actually is. One final point about trying to define what consciousness is, the Macmillan Dictionary of Psychology says that consciousness is the having of perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, awareness. One of the interesting issues with all of this is that the term itself of consciousness, in some sense, can only be grasped by those who possess it. So as human beings, we presume that we have consciousness, and so we can go about trying to understand what consciousness is and try to determine whether other animals or other things may have consciousness. But that is sometimes very, very difficult for us to do. So we have to be very cautious about, we're kind of trapped within consciousness, trying to determine what consciousness actually is. And therefore, there are some inherent problems with just trying to know what it might be and how we can look at it. And of course, many do fall into the trap of equating consciousness with self-consciousness, to be conscious of our own awareness. And that is certainly a part of consciousness. And then we get into issues about sort of differentiating awareness from consciousness and so forth. But we certainly have a reflexive self-consciousness. We are aware of ourselves, and we are aware that we are aware. So it's not just we say, oh, it's cold outside, but we are aware of ourselves perceiving that it is cold outside. So all of these things kind of swirl around in terms of the challenges of trying to address what consciousness actually is. And so, sometimes I've thought about, is it, if aliens somehow came down to Earth and were observing human beings, what would they think about whether or not we have consciousness? Could they look at everything that we do and make some inferences to whether we have consciousness? After all, we can look at a whole slew of ants in an ant colony and developing all kinds of, the whole nest and so forth that they have, and they seem to be going all different directions and doing all kinds of things. So they seem very purposeful in what they're doing, but do they have consciousness? And of course, we have no way of communicating with an ant, so we don't know whether or not they actually have consciousness and they're thinking about all the things that they have to do, just like we run around on the planet trying to do all the things that we need to do. Is it possible that it could be perceived to just be zombies who kind of act like we have consciousness, but don't really have it? Or could we just be computers that have been programmed to go to work, to raise children, to read books, to go to the market or whatever, but not necessarily be aware of what we are actually doing? So how do we think about all that? How can we tell whether any organism or anything at all is conscious and it has consciousness? So it's an interesting thought experiment, but it does challenge us when we're talking about how consciousness actually works and whether different animals, beings, machines, and so forth actually have consciousness itself. So that does lead us now, and I've kind of touched on this a little bit, but who or what actually has consciousness? Well, we typically refer consciousness to living things, animals, and people. And of course, we are animals as well. So human beings clearly seem to have consciousness. We certainly perceive that within ourselves. But what about the animals? What about the ants? We don't know much about insects at all. There have been some studies that have looked at higher level primates and dolphins who seem to be able to recognize themselves in a mirror. If you put certain marks on their head, they recognize that there's something different going on. And certain primates will actually not reach to the mirror where they see the thing, but will reach to their own head, realizing that it is, that we put a little paint on them or something like that. So maybe they have some rudimentary consciousness. Again, people certainly seem to have consciousness, but then again, it begs this very interesting question about, well, if consciousness is ultimately derived from the brain, which is a very, very complex biological machine, is it possible to create a non-biological machine with enough interconnections and computer chips and speed and so forth that creates a kind of artificial intelligence that acts as if we have consciousness? I've just been experimenting myself with software programs that some of you may have seen, that you'd say, write a report about morality in Plato's Republic or something like that, and blam, out comes what seems like a person's writing of this particular topic. So, how much can artificial intelligence ultimately go to not only seem conscious, but actually have consciousness? So again, if the brain is essentially this massive computer and input-output machine, then we theoretically can build a complex enough computer to develop consciousness. The Turing test, which was first suggested by Alan Turing probably about 60 years ago or more at this point, is kind of this classic idea about how to test if a computer has consciousness. The idea here is that you kind of sit behind a wall, if you will, and you have a conversation, usually by passing back and forth communication, maybe with a human being and then also with a computer. And the question is, can you decide which one is the human and which one is the computer? If you ultimately can't make the distinction between the human and the computer, then maybe the computer really does have consciousness. Now, again, there's a lot of interesting questions that come up when we talk about that particular type of test, but it is an interesting idea that, if we have something that really looks and feels like it has consciousness, maybe it does. And that, again, certainly begs the question of what consciousness is and what consciousness can reside in. So, up till now, I would say that computers have generally failed tests such as the Turing test, but we are getting better and better. And as I said, our computers are now able to sift through millions and millions of writing materials, going back, hundreds of millions of books and so forth since the beginning of humanity, basically. And they are doing better and better at being able to sound and write and communicate as if they have consciousness. So if ultimately a computer does pass this Turing test someday, what would we do? Will we actually accept that it has consciousness? And would we then grant it many of the rights and the ideas that we typically reserve for human beings? I think some of this has been played out in science fiction stories, Star Wars and Star Trek and so forth. Data on Star Trek, the computer who appears to have consciousness, and what that means. And so, again, really fascinating questions for us to think about. Now, when it comes to us as human beings, we seem to have consciousness, but how did we get consciousness? I mean, when we look at every other animal on the planet, clearly they have not developed the level of creativity and music and art and literature and the political and moral frameworks that we have in our societies. So something seems to have changed a bit in human beings. And how do we get here? Arguably, we would look at evolution and natural selection. But is consciousness ultimately required for us to advance and adapt? Is it some epiphenomenon? Is it something that just emerged out of the complex workings of the brain, but we didn't really need to have consciousness in order to solve the problems out there and figure out how to get food and make shelters and do all the things that we needed to do in order to survive effectively? So, consciousness may be good for all of that, may help us with all the things that we need to do, but, does it? And if so, how does it actually ultimately work? Why is the awareness itself necessary? To solve a math problem, especially a real complex one, I can't do that. I can have a computer do it. So computers can be much better at solving a math problem than me, but does that mean that the computer needed to have consciousness or not? And so there are some really important questions here when it comes to how and why consciousness actually may be part of the human brain. So it could be an adaptive advantage. It could be epiphenomenal that just came about when our brain became complex enough. But is that the case? Is it dependent only on complexity? And of course, this has important implications in the context of the machine piece. Is it just a matter of having enough interconnections between neurons? And, you know, how many, is it the number of neurons? Is it the number of connections between the neurons? Is there something else going on? Is there something to do with how energy is, you know, how metabolism, energy, neurotransmitters ultimately kind of spread throughout the brain? And of course, again, you know, one of the real problems, though, is we may have to think about it as an emergent property of the brain, because I think most of us would argue that, barring the Buddhist and Hindu perspective of all things having consciousness, but a molecule of dopamine arguably doesn't have consciousness. An atom of carbon doesn't have consciousness. But in the brain, when you put lots and lots of those dopamine molecules together, we feel something and we develop awareness and so forth. And of course, dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter, but when you have all these different molecules roaming around the brain, it seems to allow us to have consciousness. But again, it still comes back to the question of, so is the brain itself producing the consciousness? Is it somehow emerging from that complexity? Or is it that our brain is tapping into something which is beyond the brain, which has some universal aspect of consciousness that we then connect into? So how do we start to explore consciousness from more of a study perspective? Well, you know, cognitive neuroscientists certainly try to study the relationship between the mind, the brain, and our behaviors. This can include our own personal introspection. And of course, in a field that is sometimes referred to as neurotheology, an area that I've been very involved in, we're talking about the spiritual side as well as the material side of ourselves, but perhaps just through self-reflection and meditation and so forth and personal prayer, we get to study and learn about consciousness, certainly the nature of our own consciousness. And so we have an opportunity to explore consciousness from that perspective. Experimental psychology, functional neuroimaging, all of these are different ways of trying to bring together the subjective elements that exist within the person, within our own consciousness, the feelings that we have, whether we feel depressed, anxious, we have pain, and what we are aware of as part of the psychological piece, and then using some, quote unquote, objective measure, using, like, for example, a PET scan or an MRI scan to look at the metabolic activity in the brain, the blood flow in the brain, the neurotransmitters that are associated with these different states of consciousness and what the person is actually feeling and thinking. We can look at different neurological patients, people who have had a disturbance in their consciousness. So somebody who has a head injury or somebody develops Alzheimer's disease, how does that change their consciousness? Studies of neurological patients can be very helpful if we know that certain neurodegenerative diseases cause a loss of consciousness. Then maybe we can see what areas of the brain are particularly affected and have a sense as to, are those the areas that are responsible for our own consciousness? And again, we still come back to computer-based studies of robots, of artificial intelligence. Can we see how far we can go to understand how and why these different computers are working that may enable them to have things, experiences and behaviors that make them look like they have consciousness? So delving into some of these approaches in a little bit more detail, the introspective piece certainly is important. It makes sense to study, as far as we know, human beings are the only animals that at least clearly have consciousness. Again, it could be in primates and dolphins, and perhaps, all animals have some level of rudimentary consciousness, but given the fairly high level of consciousness in human beings, I think it makes sense to study that consciousness even on our own. And so various meditation techniques that help us to explore what we are feeling, what our awareness is, that can even lead to altered states of consciousness, all very important options for us to look at. Various dream states, including things like lucid dreaming, where you are kind of awake while you're dreaming, and take a look at that and what that feels like and what these different states are. There's a lot of research going on these days looking at psychedelics and drug-induced states that are always described as altered states of consciousness. And what does that mean, and how does it change the sensory perceptions that we have, the personal experiences, the ego, the loss of ego self, and so forth. So what's going on when it comes to these kinds of states, and then other self-induced altered states of consciousness that, again, could be through prayer, other types of spiritual practices, and sometimes even those that occur somewhat spontaneously. So there are lots of different ways of kind of going inward to be able to explore consciousness. And when we do that, we can then try to match up those introspective experiences with what we are able to see on a brain scan. So for example, here you have a SPECT scan of a person's brain who was a Tibetan Buddhist meditator. And so when the person is deep in meditation, which is on the right-hand side, we can look for different patterns of activity, changes in the activity in the brain compared to when the person is just at rest. So on a SPECT scan, what we're doing is we're actually looking at changes in cerebral blood flow. In general, blood flow correlates with brain activity. So the more we use a particular part of the brain, the more blood flow it gets. And the colors represent the amount of activity, the amount of blood flow that are in different areas of the brain. So the red areas are the brightest, the most active, followed by the yellow, blue, and black. In the meditation scan that we're looking at here, what we can see is that during the meditation practice, that the frontal lobe, which is being pointed to there, has this increased blob of red activity. It seems that the person has turned on their frontal lobes as they are engaged in the meditation practice. Now, the frontal lobes also are connected to lots of other parts of the brain. So if you're engaged in a practice that might be a verbal practice, you might activate some of the language centers of the brain. If it's a visual practice, you might activate the visual areas of the brain. So to us, there's this whole network of structures that seem to be involved in these practices and experiences that become activated depending on what the person is doing and what they are actually experiencing. Now, if you look a little bit higher up in the brain, now we're looking at what I dubbed here as the orientation area. So this is actually in the back of the brain. I should state that when you're looking at these scans, the top of the scan is the frontal lobe. It's as if you're looking at the person who's lying down on the scanning table from their feet. And so the top of the scan is the frontal lobe, and the bottom of the scan is the back of the brain, the parietal lobes in general. And so here we see a very significant change in the brain that is in this orientation area. So compared to the baseline state, the meditation state seems to be associated with substantially decreased blood flow. It's almost all in yellows, just a little bit of red compared to the amount of red that we saw in the baseline state, where everything is pretty uniformly distributed throughout the brain. Now, why would this be important? Well, this orientation part of the brain, the parietal lobe, actually takes a lot of our sensory information and helps us to create a spatial representation of the self. So if we start to have a decrease of activity in this area, we presumably would lose that sense of self. And again, if we're talking about now states of consciousness, we kind of lose what our self feels like. And we have an alteration in that sense of self and in that sense of awareness about ourself, as well as how our self interacts with the world around us, associated with a very intense meditation practice. And we've seen these kinds of changes in the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, as well as many other structures being involved in these practices. As I mentioned, there's a very complex set of a network of structures that seem to be involved, and it really depends on what the person is doing and what they're experiencing that shows up on the scans as affecting the brain in one way or another. So these functional neuroimaging studies can evaluate the brain structures that appear to be involved in these different mental states and different states of consciousness. We can try to do scans of people who are actually in different states of consciousness, whether that is somebody who may be taking a psychedelic drug, somebody who's deep in meditation or prayer, or a variety of other states, dream states and the like. So we can look at what these different states appear to be, and whether that may have, we could try to understand what areas of the brain are associated with these different levels of consciousness. Of course, I think a very important point is that while neuroimaging these days is really quite remarkable in terms of what it can show us, it clearly has its limitations as well. And so, at the moment, we can't really say this is where consciousness actually is. And I challenge a lot of my students, and I've sort of alluded to this already, that, I can do brain scans of dopamine and blood flow and metabolism, and we can look at the electrical changes in the brain and how all the different neurons are interconnected with each other. But where in all of that, where in all of those molecules and interconnections and electrical activity does consciousness actually seem to arise? Where are our thoughts in the brain? And we really don't have an answer there. So while we can look and try to understand it, we have to recognize certain limitations, certainly where we are today, but we'll see where all of the science ultimately can take us. Now, apropos of that, one of the areas that we've been particularly interested in, both in terms of spiritual experiences as well as the notion of consciousness, is a very central structure called the thalamus. It would make some sense that a central structure like the thalamus might be important for consciousness because it's central and it connects with lots of different parts of the brain. It's also very involved in our sensory processes. And so one of the things that we did was we took people through an 8-week meditation program where they meditated weekly, daily, I should say, for 8 weeks. And we scanned them initially at baseline, and then we scanned them again when they came back after 8 weeks. And what we found was that there were some significant shifts going on in the activity in the thalamus. So as you can see on this scan, in the pre-meditation program scan, one side of the thalamus seems to be a bit more red and blobbier than the other side. But when the person comes back, it's far more balanced. And maybe I could even convince you that the other side is even a little bit more active. So if there's a significant shift, even at rest, by doing a meditation program, then maybe it changes how we can be aware of different things. Maybe it can change our consciousness. Again, the thalamus is certainly not the only player when it comes to consciousness, but it probably has an important role in general when we're talking about what consciousness is, at least with regard to the brain. I've touched on this a little bit, but let me again just go into a little bit more detail that virtually any medical factor can affect brain function and potentially consciousness. So we see this with different medications, and that doesn't have to be psychedelic drugs, but any medication, anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, and so forth, some heart medicines, blood pressure medicines, and things like that. Depending on what happens, they can alter your level of consciousness. They can make you pass out. They can make you feel funny. And so, we could look at that. Why is it that when you take an antihistamine, it knocks you out? Why is it that, when you take an anti-anxiety medication, it calms you down? And then there are certainly various neurological conditions. So head injuries, dementia, tumors, strokes, and people can look at all of these and see how they affect people. Like, for example, a very interesting study looked at people who had tumors or strokes in different parts of the brain and found that people who had lesions in the parietal lobe that we talked about just a few minutes ago were more likely to express feelings of self-transcendence. So they were feeling already a kind of loss of the sense of self and a change in their consciousness as the result of having this tumor or stroke in the parietal lobe. And that was different than people who had these abnormalities in other parts of the brain. So, again, we get little avenues of understanding in terms of how these different disorders will actually affect people. Seizures is another one I don't have listed here, but seizures clearly alter a person's consciousness, and sometimes they become unconscious in like a grand mal seizure. But there have been some very interesting examples of people who have seizures who have unusual spiritual experiences, and so again, we can talk more about, well, how do those areas of the brain affect those experiences? What's going on, and how do we understand them? Other types of disturbances, electrolyte, hormonal imbalances, and so forth also can all affect a person's mood, cognition, experiences, and ultimately consciousness. And two other, particularly interesting examples of this are split brain patients and then patients who have something called blind sight. So split brain patients don't happen too often anymore, but these were seizure patients who had the connections between the two hemispheres cut, so that it would prevent the exchange of the seizures between those two hemispheres. But as a result, it appears that it almost kind of sets up two different consciousnesses, one on the left and one on the right side of the brain. And part of how we know that is that usually in individuals, one side of the brain, typically the left side, is more involved in language. And so and what's interesting about how our brain is set up is that we can present objects into our visual fields that go to one hemisphere or the other. So if I present, for example, a picture of a hammer to the left hemisphere, then, and I said, what do you see? The person will say, I saw a hammer. If you present it to the right side of the brain that doesn't have language, you say, what do you see? They're not able to articulate what they see. But you say, you ask them, how would you use it? And they might, make a hammering motion with their hands. Then, of course, if you say, well, why did you do that? Then they might make up some story that, well, their wrist was feeling a little loose or something like that, or tight. And but they don't, so they sort of recognize the what they're seeing, but they can't articulate it in language. And it kind of sets up this idea of having almost two separate consciousnesses. Now, blind sight is another very interesting circumstance where typically people have damage in the visual area of their brain. And what happens is that they will tell you that they are blind. They will tell you that they can't see. But if you test them, if you ask them to kind of navigate through a room, or if you show them different objects, they do better than just pure guessing. So they seem to act as if they have sight, even though they will tell you that they do not have sight. So somewhere there's visual information that's being transmitted back and forth in the brain, but it's not getting up to the areas of our brain that make us consciously aware of what we are looking at. So we don't fully know exactly what's going on or why or how it may work. But somewhere in the context of the visual system and the different cortical and subcortical areas, a person seems to be acting as if they're seeing things, even though they don't feel like they have it. So where is consciousness located in the brain? Well, we've talked about a few areas such as the thalamus. We've talked a little bit about the frontal lobes that help us to concentrate and focus our attention, the parietal lobes, and how the parietal lobe interacts with the temporal lobe, with our spatial representations. There's probably at least about 20 different locations that have been proposed. And some of them are very specific. They say this, it's in this particular nucleus of the thalamus. But I think most people really feel that mental states in general, and consciousness certainly in particular, are kind of distributed throughout the brain. Part of the evidence for that with consciousness is that if we do surgeries to remove parts of a person's brain, you can remove a lot of brain tissue and the person still feels that they kind of know who they are. So it's difficult to really isolate a seat of consciousness, but certainly there are a lot of different parts of the brain that seem to be involved, and exactly how and when and where and at what point, if you cut enough fiber connections, do you lose consciousness? Those are some of the big questions that we're still trying to work on. Now, as I mentioned, all of what I've just been going over the last maybe 10 slides or so is really a more materialistic perspective. It's that cognitive neuroscience, it's the brain, it's coming from the brain. But there are these alternative approaches to understanding what consciousness is. And they typically take the form of various Buddhist and Hindu ideologies. The idea that consciousness is a universal characteristic. So the whole universe is conscious. Consciousness exists in everything, including the non-material. So the chair I'm sitting on, the computer that you might be looking at, the car that you drive, all of these things, as well as all the animals and ourselves, have consciousness. And in that case, the brain itself isn't really necessary for consciousness, at least in terms of producing it, but maybe it is important for how we begin to kind of coalesce consciousness into our body and into what we ultimately refer to as ourself. So this kind of brings us to the broader question of, well, so what is, where does consciousness fit in the context of the universe? Is consciousness derived from matter, or is matter derived from consciousness? And this is a really challenging question, and something that is really at the heart of the presentation today. So let's just take a look at what those two options may look like. Well, if matter is the primary stuff of the universe, and again, this is certainly how science thinks about things, and starting with the Big Bang, and then development and evolution of human beings and the brain. So if matter is primary, clearly we don't have any problems explaining the material world because it's matter. But if we're looking at all of this, rocks and stars and so forth that don't have consciousness, how did consciousness occur? Why does it suddenly happen to occur? We don't really have an answer for that. Does it exist in all living material? But again, you even have that kind of distinction, that little quantum leap between living and non-living. And so, what makes something living and what makes something non-living? Are viruses living or are they not? They're obviously right on that cusp. Does consciousness just naturally emerge? And this has certainly been a very strong argument from a lot of people. They say, look, a molecule of water doesn't feel wet, but if you have, quadrillions of molecules of water and you get that thrown in your face, it feels wet. So, it doesn't exist on the molecular level, but it does exist on a more when you're talking about the larger amount of things. So there's a level of complexity or amount that ultimately leads to a particular type of thing. And in this case, maybe if the brain itself is complex enough, consciousness emerges out of that. But, again, is it really just a matter of complexity, or is there something more to consciousness that we're not able to determine? So that leads us to the other alternative. What if consciousness is the primary stuff of the universe? Well, the good news about that is that, it explains why consciousness is in us. Consciousness is everywhere. So explaining how consciousness gets into ourselves is very easy. But now we have the flip problem of trying to explain material reality. So if consciousness is everything and everything is just thought and consciousness, then where do stars and planets come from? Where do the atoms come from? Certainly there have been theories about how that may happen. Maybe material reality emerges from consciousness instead of consciousness emerging from material reality. In the Buddhist and Hindu perspectives, that's certainly the case. But even there's a little bit of a parallel even in the monotheistic traditions, because the consciousness of God creates the universe. And in the Bible, God says, "Let there be light," and God creates the heavens and the earth through God's consciousness. So there's some precedent for the idea that the physical world can derive from something which is non-physical. But again, we don't have a clear answer as to how that would actually happen. But again, if we go back to if consciousness is primary, then we can also argue, well, clearly it shouldn't be too hard to make a computer that has consciousness, because everything has consciousness. And so we just need to make a computer complex enough to be able to express that consciousness to us, but it already is inherent within the computers themselves. Now, one thing that I've mused over in the field of neurotheology and thinking about these spiritual experiences that people have, one of the interesting aspects of mystical experiences is that they seem to kind of go beyond matter and consciousness. People talk about getting beyond the objective and subjective nature of reality, going beyond the brain. And I've sometimes thought about whether, a little bit like in quantum mechanics, when we're talking about like a photon of light, if you look for it as being a wave, then light acts as a wave. But if you look at it as being a particle, then light seems to act like a photon, like a particle. So maybe consciousness and matter are similarly associated with each other, in that they're really just two sides of the same coin. And that if you actually try to find, you do a brain scan of consciousness, well, you're going to find the thalamus and the frontal lobe. So you find the material elements of what consciousness is. And on the other hand, if you do introspection and so forth, and you have a mystical experience, well, then you find consciousness and subjectivity, but you don't necessarily find the material part. Now, again, that is purely speculative. And I do want to be clear that I'm not saying that we can explain consciousness on the basis of quantum mechanics, although other people have even gone down that path, and there's still a number of scholars looking at that perspective as well. But the idea that maybe consciousness and the material are just two ways of looking at the same thing. And again, this certainly has been something that appears to crop up when people start to describe mystical experiences that go beyond what is just the material world and go beyond even what is objective and subjective. So, hopefully I haven't given anybody too bad of a headache in thinking about what consciousness is, but clearly, as you can see, it is one of the most mysterious aspects of the human being, perhaps one of the most mysterious aspects in the universe. As human beings, we all seem to have it. We have difficulty proving it. We certainly have difficulty proving it in others, although we seem to all perceive that we ourselves have it. But it is a real challenge to figure out how we look at what consciousness is. We can look at altered states of consciousness. We can study meditation and other spiritual practices. But what do these states ultimately imply in terms of trying to understand what consciousness actually may be? Can we ever create a consciousness in a computer? Well, that also depends on what consciousness actually is, how complex a computer we might be ultimately able to develop, and whether matter or consciousness is actually primary in the universe. So can we ever know what the true nature of reality is? You know, on one hand, we are always trapped within our mind, trapped within our consciousness. And in that regard, we don't really know what is going on in the world out there. But perhaps by continuing to do introspection and science that has the ability to look at these questions, we may someday get there. And that's part of why I feel that the field of neurotheology may be our best chance, because it is actually an integrated hybrid approach that brings kind of the best of the spiritual and the consciousness side together with the best of what science, and particularly neuroscience, can tell us about ourselves as human beings. So hopefully, as we all keep pushing forward and trying to answer these questions, we will come to some conclusions that might be something that we can all appreciate and understand, and will teach us what consciousness is. We discuss a lot of these kinds of experiences in our most recent book called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, where we do talk about what these mystical experiences feel like, other types of spiritual experiences, and those that kind of intersect with material reality as well as what is perceived to be the supernatural. And if you are interested in exploring other areas of neurotheology that pertain to spirituality and religion, again, there are a number of other options for you to look at in terms of how our brain intersects with the spiritual. And I certainly would love to enable all of you to reach out, and you can get me through my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. You can read more about the research studies that we've been doing, the new books that we have, and hopefully together we will find an answer to what consciousness is. Thank you very much for your time.